Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today at First Communications. I'm Woody Johnson. I'm going to be your host for the next 45 minutes or so. Let me give a quick apology for my voice. I've woke up with either a cold or some allergies, so I'm going to do my best to speak as clearly and as loudly as I can, though I can't hear very much, but I'm going to do my best here with us today. First, I understand that we have several customers joining our webinar today. For you in particular, I'd like to say thanks for your business. We really appreciate it, and it's very important to us. And for everyone else on the call, thanks for your time. I hope you find it valuable today. Just a quick note of housekeeping. If all lines are muted right now, and if you have any questions, you should have a little chat box, a little blue box in the bottom left-hand part of your screen. Feel free to use that chat box and type in your questions or comments. At the end of the presentation, if we have time, and we should, we'll get those questions answered for you. There we go. Our slides seem to be moving at this point. So I have two personal objectives here, really, for our time together this morning. First, if you're an expert at disaster recovery, you've been doing this for 30 years, and you've created a ton of disaster recovery plans, you really know what you're doing. My objective for you is hopefully to give you just one fresh idea over our short time together this morning. If I can do that, if I can get you to think about either dusting off that disaster recovery plan that you haven't tested for a while and testing it, or maybe tweaking it just slightly based on how things work today, I've met my objective for you. If this is a little bit newer to you, my objective is really to get you a start. We're not going to be able to develop a disaster recovery plan for your specific business or organization in the coming 30 minutes or so. But if I can get you a good start in order to do further research and give you some resources, I've definitely met my goal for you as well. Not to worry, we're going to cover a lot of ground in a very, very short period of time. This webinar is being recorded. It will appear on the FirstCom website, so you can reference it, pull the slides down at your convenience, and look at the additional resources that we're going to give you. The follow-up, again, if you're a little bit newer to the idea of disaster recovery and just starting to learn, maybe writing your first disaster recovery plan. So there's 4 or 5 terms that you're going to see no matter where you go, no matter what white paper you look at, no matter what research you do, no matter what webinar you attend. So we're going to go over those briefly, and they're very simple, but they're pretty much global and used in practically every white paper you ever read. So the first is an overall umbrella term, business continuity, and that's exactly what that means. If any event of any kind occurs that disrupts your business in any way, disrupts a process, a system, stops you from making a product or providing a service, your capability to work around that process and get things back to normal is generally known as business continuity. Disaster recovery is really a subset of business continuity. And so when we're talking about disaster recovery, we're generally talking about communication systems. Business continuity can mean anything. Could mean a bunch of employees are sick or got the flu or they're out or it's weather related. Disaster recovery generally is focusing in on communication systems and the failures that can occur there and how you deal with those failures. A disaster recovery plan is, in fact, a written document, and we're going to spend some time talking about that throughout the coming slides, but a disaster recovery plan is first and foremost a written document that you put together and you share with your employees. And it's part of the overall business continuity planning. When you start to set up your disaster recovery plan, one of the early things you're going to do is set goals. There's also some common language used in disaster recovery planning for goals. Again, these are simple ideas, but a lot of times people will use them, and if you don't know what they mean, you get a little bit lost in the weeds there somewhat. So RTO, recovery time objective, it's just kind of a fancy way to say how much downtime can you stand. So for a particular application, a particular communications link, a particular system, can I handle an hour downtime? Is that going to be unacceptable to me? Can I handle a day? Is that going to be unacceptable to me? So recovery time objective is just another way to say what's your acceptable downtime. Recovery point objective, when we use RPO, we're generally talking about loss of data. So this is generally determined by how often you do your backups. It's one of the main ways you can determine what your recovery point objective is. So are you doing backups once a week, every 10 minutes, every hour? That's going to pretty much tell you what your goal is for your recovery point objective. And recovery level objective is simply setting priorities. It's the easiest way to think about it. So not everything is necessarily, if you have a major outage, not everything is necessarily going to be as important to recover first. Some things will be more on an emergency basis, and how you set up those priorities is your recovery level objective. So those may have different time frames, obviously, for each system or each application or communications link, et cetera. Business impact analysis is really the last term you need to know as you're doing research in this field. So BIA, business impact analysis, is really the cost of an outage. So as you look at your different applications or systems, et cetera, what is the real cost of my business? We're going to delve into this a little bit deeper here in a few minutes. But at its simplest, business impact analysis equals what's the cost of my business or my organization if I lose something. Let's talk about the most common causes. I will take full blame for this particular list of causes. In 25 years or so of researching this subject matter, this is what I believe to be true. If you look back at some of the common disaster recovery websites, things like the federal FEMA site or other federal government type sites, if you look at some of the common definitions of what a disaster is or what disaster recovery is, there's going to be a lot of discussion, and you're going to find a lot of discussion and research on large disasters. I mean, floods, and in the Midwest, it's tornadoes, et cetera, fires. And in fact, it's important to take those things into consideration and plan for them. But in reality, natural disasters or those kinds of disasters are a very small percentage of what we're actually protecting for, of what actually occurs. The most common things that occur, and every recent study that I've read, every recent survey I've read tells me that malicious behavior, power outages, and human errors are the top three. Those are the things that you need to think about first, in my opinion. I can't give you good statistics. I can give you opinions on which of those three are the worst or the most common. Malicious behavior is in the news an awful lot, so it's obviously growing. Power outages have traditionally been an issue for us, and human error has definitely been an issue for us. Hardware failure and software failure, of course those things occur, and of course we should try to plan for them as well, but they don't nearly occur as often as what we might call the big three. Let's look at a couple examples. Many of you may be familiar with Dyn. Dyn was acquired fully by Oracle, I think at the beginning of this year, so I guess we call them Oracle Dyn now. But back in October, there was a major outage that hit Dyn. Now Dyn, if you're not very familiar with them, is a very large, sophisticated provider of managed DNS and other internet managed type services. So sometime on an early business morning, almost all of Dyn's DNS servers went down throughout the United States and in a good portion of Europe. It was a couple of hours outage. The reason this is a big deal is a couple of reasons, two or three. One is, if you're familiar with Dyn, they are a respected company. They are experts at what they do. They were started and continue to be run by people with advanced computer science degrees from very high-level schools, from Ivy League type schools. This is a group of smart folks. I respect them all, and I respect the company. To get hit by something like this and have this kind of an outage, you take notice, and I think the internet community in general took notice. What was the cause? The cause was a very complex distributed denial of service, or DDoS attack, on their servers. It occurred for a couple hours in the morning, and then again for an hour or hour and 15 minutes in the afternoon. So not only was it unusual to see something like this happen at such a sophisticated company, the type of attack was also unusual in that this just wasn't a bunch of hackers getting together and attacking their servers, trying to overrun and overpower their DNS servers. These hackers actually took control of what's estimated to be over 100,000 devices across the world that we often call in general the Internet of Things. And so these guys took control through botnets over things like IP cameras, my webcam at home, network-based IP printers. Those kinds of things were taken control and used to attack Dyn servers on that October day. Highly unusual. What's the lesson for us in disaster recovery planning? The lesson is really to take a strong look at what we're doing for internet security. If a company like Dyn, and you've heard of others recently in the news, can be attacked and brought down by hackers off the internet, certainly your business can as well. So it behooves us all to take a very strong look at what we're doing for internet security, to update that security, keep it updated, or sign up for services from a managed security provider that can keep those updates and those patches going for you. Just one more example here. This is from about a month ago, last May, British Airways. Some of you may have heard of this that occurred. If you take a quick look at the middle of this picture, you'll see a guy there with bare feet laying on his back taking a nap. A lot of folks here at FirstCom say that that's what I look like in the middle of the afternoon, but don't believe it, it's not true. This was an outage that affected about 300,000 travelers on the first day of the outage, and then many thousands of more over the next couple of days while British Airways got their systems back online. What basically happened here? From what I've read, what basically happened is there was a power outage or a power spike that took their production IT environment offline, and it took their outsourced IT vendor a couple of days, certainly the entire first 20 hours or so, to get the backup systems online. Now, you know British Airways. British Airways is a very large corporation. They have tons of resources. They obviously have some internal, probably very detailed disaster recovery plans. What's the lesson here? You know, was this a power outage? Would we say that? Would we say it's a human error type of issue? You know, is it a breath mint? Basically, in my opinion, this was a lack of training, and we'll talk about that briefly as well. So if you have a disaster recovery plan in place, you need to continue to train your employees on what that is. This is the lesson that British Airways learned by what I would say was not the best training for their IT organization. So let's talk about strategies. And you can break down disaster recovery strategies in kind of three areas. The more preventive ones, which are things like training or uninterruptible power supplies, or network design, which we'll talk about briefly when you're doing failover. Those are good preventive measures. Certainly doing software updates. We all talk about it, but we need to do it. We need to be diligent in our software patches, and that's going to protect us from a number of vulnerabilities out there and potentially protect us from a number of outages that might occur. And then there are more what I would refer to as the detective ones. That is, it lets us know something bad is starting to happen, and we need to do something about that. I'm going to stop here for a second and give you a personal example, and the reason I got into and became interested about 25 years ago in disaster recovery planning. At the time, I worked for a company called MCI, which some of you may know. It's defunct now. It went bankrupt and ended up being purchased by Verizon Corporation. But at the time, in the early 1990s, MCI's largest production data center was in a little place, in a little town of North Royalton, Ohio. And this was a massive facility. Basically, everything that made that company run was in production at this facility. In fact, we used to tell customers that we were guessing it was the largest amount of computing power in MIPS under one roof in the entire world. It was an important place. It was also a major junction station on the telecommunications network. So north, south, east, west type communications went through the North Royalton facility. And it was very important. It was also unmanned on the weekends. Didn't see a reason at the time. Management didn't see a reason to have anyone there. It generally ran itself, and people might stop by to pick up equipment or do something like that on the dispatch, but it was generally unmanned on the weekends. On a hot August weekend, I believe it was 1992, the air conditioning went out. And as luck would have it, and timing would have it, all of that delicate electronic equipment that sat in basically an easy bake oven all weekend decided to fail right around the opening of business on Monday morning. And it was a mess. That kind of an outage is required to be reported, required to be reported to the Federal Communication Commission. And at times, when there's an extremely large outage, and this may be the largest telecommunication outage that I am aware of, the FCC will often come out, do a report, a study, interview employees, those kinds of things. What got me interested in disaster recovery was that summary report that the FCC did. The FCC said that they estimated more than 10% of all voice and data traffic between Chicago and the major East Coast cities had failed that day due to this outage. They also summarized everything by saying that if MCI had placed a high temperature alarm in the facility, there was a likely chance this outage would not occur. So for lack of a $10 or $20 telemetry alarm in that data center, one of the largest outages occurred in all of history. The importance of spending perhaps a little bit of money to save a lot later on. Under corrective, we're mostly talking about disaster recovery planning and the disaster recovery documentation that occurs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about network design and roll in a couple of services that you'll hear about from different companies today. One of the simplest and sometimes can be one of the most expensive is a simple physical-to-physical design. So you may be hosting servers somewhere in your own data center and are going to replicate that and provide backup circuits to a provider's data center, for instance, to First Communications data center. There's a lot of ways to set up this kind of network diversity. You can do it with traditional private lines or MPLS type service. You can, depending on your business and how comfortable it is, you can set up VPN tunneling across internet services for backup, or use some of the more advanced features like software-defined WANs that are becoming available today throughout the market. Cloud-based file level backup is exactly like it sounds. It's one of the simplest and often one of the least expensive. So this would include things like AWS services, Google Drive, things like that can be effective, perhaps not business class always, but can be effective to help you with your disaster recovery planning and your file backup. Cloud-based file level backup along with active passive machine level generally are bundled into services that often service providers call disaster recovery as a service. And you'll see that term out there. It is an often used service. It can be cost effective. You do need to spend some time discussing exactly what you're backing up, how much space you're going to use, how much time you need. So sometimes those are simply backed up to, for instance, cold virtual servers. So if you do have a disaster, you do have an outage, you may have wait time, of course, to get those servers spinned up. So, but it is often a good option. Active hot site is also used traditionally quite often, and this is also exactly like it sounds. You've got two data centers, for instance. They're mirroring each other. All the data is replicated across each other. Either can be used at either time. Either can be failed over to, or you can go back and forth and use either one as needed, even sometimes on a per packet or per packet flow basis. You don't see this as much today. And it's not only the expense, it is the fact that many of you and other organizations are moving so much of your business to the cloud, your communications to the cloud, your applications to the cloud. So as example, if you're using Office 365, you fully expect that your service provider is going to have this in their network. They are going to be geographically diverse data centers where they're mirroring things, and if you have any kind of an outage on that application, it's going to be minimal and you will not lose any data. So that would be my most important point to you on services today, because I know many of you are moving to the cloud. Make sure and ask your provider, what do you have in your network for disaster recovery? I do want to talk, so some of those preventive measures I talked about were network monitoring. And this is something that's often overlooked. So let's say you're responsible for your infrastructure at your business or your organization. So you do everything possible the right way. You have backup internet providers, so you went and you got internet service from First Communications because you know that never goes down, and then you, just to be sure, go ahead and get a second internet service provider out there as well. In addition, you do things like have redundant firewalls, redundant routers, redundant switches. You put everything together just the way you should. But what happens inevitably is somebody takes a laptop home. It's probably a company executive. They take a laptop home. They decide to do a little shopping, check their personal email, something like that. And sure enough, they click on something they shouldn't or open an attachment they shouldn't, and they've got a virus. They come back to the office, they plug in the next morning, and like any good virus, it phones home. And now your network starts to get flooded with traffic. What you know, if you're responsible for this without a lot of good monitoring tools, is that you're taking a lot of phone calls. You're taking phone calls from end users who are saying, gee, everything seems so slow, my screen's painting, I'm having trouble getting to websites, what is going on out here? Without a good set of network management monitoring tools, you'll figure out what's going on from your own experience or from doing simple things like pinging and looking around the network, etc. You'll also probably call your service provider and ask them if they know anything that's going on. But your troubleshooting time can be pretty great. If you add to your network monitoring tools something like NetFlow, here at FirstCom, we use a number of network management monitoring tools, but we also, one of the platforms we use is by a company called SolarWinds, which many of you may have heard of. And we use NetFlow, which is basically application-level data flow from one interface to another interface. When you can trace that, you can, in a few minutes, figure out exactly where the problem is or where it started, and a pretty good guess at the time of what you need to do to get your network back to stability. So the lesson here is, when you're thinking about disaster recovery, it may be prudent on your part to spend a little money on some better network monitoring tools, or look at a service provider that can provide those tools on your behalf. When we talk about actually developing a plan, a document, we've broken this down into basically 10 steps, and I'll talk about a couple of these in detail, but basically the first 5 are discovery steps. You're going to figure out who's going to lead this effort. You know, who's going to be my DR, disaster recovery coordinator? Do I need a team to help that person out? What is my real cost to downtime for certain applications or certain systems or certain communications links? And then you're going to set priorities and set goals. The last 5 steps are really what we refer to as action steps. So you're going to start taking a look at what is it going to take for me to recover from some of these possible outage issues, and then you're going to actually create a manual, a written document that you can share with the rest of the company, share with the other employees, and train on, and then you're going to implement and test and revise that as needed going forward. Let's talk about just a couple of these. Assembling a disaster recovery team. So that can be one person, but often it is not. You certainly, if you're an IT leader, can lead something like that, but you definitely need important stakeholders from the company. You need ownership from the company or senior leadership from the company, because decisions are going to have to be made. Those decisions might be financial, or it might be process-wise, or it might in fact be priority-driven. So you need that leadership stake as well as possibly stakeholders from other departments for their input as you put together your priorities and decide what is it I can afford to do in the disaster recovery, failover kind of mode, and what is it I'm going to have to wait on now, possibly for the future, or possibly never implement. So that disaster recovery team is important. Having executive sponsorship of that team and involvement, even more important. You're going to perform that business impact analysis. I mentioned that kind of by definition, it's a how much does downtime cost you kind of process. It's more important than just the financials if you can't provide a service for that hour or make a product for that day. There's a lot of other things to take into account, which is why, again, you probably need somewhat of a diversified team to help you. Think about the MCI outage I talked about a little bit ago. That was a terrible competitive blow. Back in the early 90s, MCI's major competitors were wireline carriers Sprint and AT&T. And I know from being a sales engineer at that point as well that those competitors brought out practically every presentation they made to customers, basically something along the lines of, do you want to do business with a company that won't spend $10 on a high-temperature telemetry alarm for their largest data center in the network? Is that who you want to do business with? MCI's current customers who got hit by that outage, and there were many, we took a tremendous blow at the time in our reputation. So there's much more to take into account than simply the financials. There are those other things, the regulatory, operational, and obviously your reputation is at stake when these things happen. You do need to prioritize. I've mentioned that a couple of times. It's rare when you sit down and take an honest evaluation of your current services and of the current connections and current network you have in place, that you can honestly say everything is an emergency. Everything must be backed up, and everything must be available 100% of the time. There are going to be those different levels, and those are tough decisions that need to be made. As part of that, the last part of that kind of data gathering process and building your disaster recovery plan, you're going to be looking at those things we talked about, basically your recovery level objective. I'm going to give you a quick example for this as well, and my goodness, I hope I remember not to use the company's name because this company is still in business and I don't want to get in trouble. About 10 years ago, a fairly large company, maybe at the time 25,000 employees or so, decided they were going to move to Salesforce.com. And they moved to Salesforce.com. All of the processes involved throughout the company were touched by Salesforce.com. This was like an 8,000-seat implementation of what we would generally refer to as a CRM tool. It was not a cloud-based implementation. The company decided that they would run Salesforce on their own servers. And so one of the leaders in the IT group held the first of a planning meeting that I got invited to, working there at the time. And he brought major stakeholders from around the company and said, all right, let's talk about our goals for backing up and recovering from an issue with our Salesforce.com servers. I'll never forget the executive vice president of sales, who, if you're in sales, you're quite often aggressive, and he was very aggressive. And he said, I cannot stand a minute of outage. My organization of nearly 5,000 salespeople must have access to Salesforce.com all the time. They're using it all day. They're using it at home at night. They're using it on the weekends. They're putting everything in there, proposals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can't stand any outage on this. Well, that's great. And you can certainly design around that kind of requirement. And some of the IT organization at the company did exactly that. The problem was that best practices for a complex application like Salesforce.com say that you don't back up everything on a specific geographic server. There are many modules in Salesforce.com if you've ever used it, and so generally you back up those different modules in different parts of your network and geographically to separate servers. That's excellent practice, and that's exactly what the company did. The problem is that not all of the right stakeholders were involved, and so the IT stakeholders that set up the basic access to Salesforce.com, that is, they were backing up the sales reps' profiles, their permissions, the features they were allowed to use in Salesforce.com, what modules were they allowed to access to. Those were backed up almost constantly and replicated and mirrored. And if there was a problem, you had access still to Salesforce.com. Some of the other IT groups who were responsible for some of the other backups used what they typically did, which was Saturday night weekly backups. So of course, the worst happened. On a Wednesday night or Thursday morning, a lot of the production servers went out, and to make matters worse, a lot of the data got corrupted, and so everyone had access to Salesforce.com. The problem is contracts done since the previous Sunday, orders placed that were in the beginning stages of provisioning, proposals put out in the previous 3 or 4 business days were all lost. In the group that I work for in Salesforce, we even lost our calendars of upcoming appointments and who we were meeting with and what the conference calls were. So the point of all of that discussion and somebody else's mistake is that these goals and objectives require a lot of input, possibly from a number of different stakeholders, and cannot be taken lightly. You can't just say, well, I can't ever have an outage, I can't stand it. Or you can't just say, well, it's up to you guys in IT, back things up like you always do, and I'm sure we'll be fine. It really requires a lot of effort on all of our parts to put together a good disaster recovery plan. When you've got the basic goals together, you'll then look at gaps. The most important thing to say about this is don't think that it's always about technology. Don't think it's always about throwing new money at something. Sometimes the simplest things can help you overcome some of those gaps that you may have in today's environment in recovering from a disaster. So we've kind of talked about this, or I've talked around this a little bit throughout the last half hour or so. Generally and traditionally, you've got very simple things, very affordable things. It might be as easy as, all right, I lose a particular office, I can have my employees work remotely. Not a lot of cost to that, and fairly simple. All the way up to those hot, active type site scenarios. This is another reason that I encourage customers today to look at, if at all possible and seems feasible to your business, to move more and more of your business applications to the cloud. Those more expensive kinds of disaster recovery scenarios can easily be borne, not easily, but should be borne, and you can demand that they be provided by a managed service provider when they're providing either communications or applications in the cloud. So certainly the culmination of meetings and discussions and priority setting and goal setting does result in an actual document. This is the most tedious part of putting together a disaster recovery plan. It may be the longest part as well. It requires a tremendous amount of research, and it in fact is a document that can be put together and shared with employees. It's an ongoing issue for most mid-sized organizations, even small organizations, due to natural things in the business. You try to keep things updated, and you have what is generally referred to as server drift or configuration drift. So things change in the business, and if you're in charge of your disaster recovery plan or in charge of documentation, you may not always be aware. Maybe someone at a specific site orders a new circuit from the local telecom provider and doesn't even tell you about it. These are difficult things, but the better job we can do at keeping our documentation up to date, the better job we're going to do in our disaster recovery planning. And then, of course, you've got to implement the plan, and you've got to let the employees know about it. It doesn't do you any good to have a plan and have an expert, and you're the only person at the company that really understands what's going on. So you really have to train your employees as much as possible on what to do in a particular outage situation. What are we going to do as the disaster recovery team, and what are we expecting of you, Mr. or Mrs. Employee, as you're part of all of this? And test and revise. This is an easy thing to say and a difficult thing to do. Some of you out there may be under heavy regulation, federal regulation or governmental regulation, and you must test and revise your disaster recovery plan on a certain basis. Working with banking customers in the banking industry over the years, it's an obvious example of where you have to have in place a disaster recovery plan for your IT infrastructure and systems, and you have to test it. You are required to do so. My point in this is, as you do your testing, set up your testing, think a little bit about who's going to do the test for you. Who's going to actually put that in motion? Most companies will take their expert, their IT director, IT VP, the person that basically spearheaded developing the plan. They'll send them to another city if they need to spin up new servers in a data center or do whatever required for their specific disaster recovery plan. What I'd like you to think about a little bit is that the right person? What if that person is not available? Perhaps you should send someone else on the staff, give that a try, and see how well it works. It didn't work well for British Airways last month. Maybe it's something you should test and revise your plan according to how that occurs. I'm going to leave you with several resources before we take questions, if there are any. First, I think I mentioned it at the beginning of our webinar. This is being recorded. It will be on our website, so you can certainly listen to that at your convenience. Go over the slides again. On our FirstCom website is what I believe to be one of your best resources. If you have yet to develop your own disaster recovery plan, we have a disaster recovery template in our white paper section of firstcom.com. It's 28 or 30 pages of a fillable PDF file, and if you haven't developed your own plan in the past, this will give you a good start on many of the things we've talked about and several that we haven't. If you do have a disaster recovery plan in place, download the template and take a look. Compare it to what you have. You may come up with some fresh ideas. So it might be worth a few minutes, even if you're an expert in this field. There are many sites out there, many providers of managed services, managed disaster recovery services that I find valuable. SunGuard has been around for a long time. Their site has an excellent knowledge center. I often look at that myself. Island.com is the same. Of course, both those companies are trying to sell you something. Just be aware of that. But certainly they have some good documentation out there to do a little further research. DRJ.com, DisasterRecoveryJournal.com, is my #1 resource for continuing to learn in this subject area. I get their email updates every week. I spend at least a couple of hours each week reading their white papers or attending their webinars. It's an excellent source. I highly recommend it. There are many others out there, and hopefully you will find your own. In addition, we'd like to help you at First Communications. If you don't know how to contact us, you can call this toll-free number, 866-261-0259. The person that answers that phone, you can simply mention that you were on a recent webinar, tell them what the subject matter is, and they'll make sure and get you in contact with the right folks in the right department here to consult with you and help you with any of your services. That is the end of my presentation today. I hope the last 45 minutes have been of some value to you. Let me take a quick look and see if we have any